Building the user interface with HTML5. We're going to be talking about HTML5 tags to organize content and forms, and also for input and validation. The agenda is semantic HTML, then we'll be looking at tables and lists, thirdly input and forms, and finally form validation. HTML5 has introduced several new elements for organizing content and forms on web pages. The new tags for organizing content are header, section and footer. The names of these tags are representative of semantic markup. In the image on the left hand side you can see this semantic markup and how it relates to the actual look, the layout of content within a web page. Semantic markup ensures that tag names match with the function that a tag performs. For example, the footer tag is used to create the footer of a web page. These are more intuitive. HTML4 and before, developers had to rely on the use of the div tag to perform a variety of different functions. The div from the div tag is short for division. The use of the div tag typically requires the use of the class or ID attributes. The class and ID are global attributes, which means they can be used with any HTML element. The class and ID can be assigned any value by a developer. The class is used to identify a group of elements, i.e. multiple elements on a page, whereas ID is used to identify individual elements. This particular ID then can identify an element perhaps which you might want to manipulate with JavaScript and update the content of. How does markup differ between HTML 4.01 and HTML5? You can see on the page you have how the content might be described within HTML4 and how it would be described using HTML5. Okay, within the actual markup. You can see there's a prolific use of divs in HTML4, whereas in HTML5 we're using these new elements such as nav, header, section, article, aside and footer. Let's have a look at some other structural tags within HTML5. We've got address, which would define an actual area for contact information for a page or section. Article would define an article such as a magazine or newspaper article, blog post or some similar content. And aside would define content that's separate from but related to the page content. Details contains additional details pertinent to text around it. It would create an interactive widget that a user can display or hide. Footer defines a footer for a document or section. A header defines a header for a document or section. Groups headings and subheadings. A nav defines a block of navigation links. Section defines a particular section such as a chapter, part of a thesis. And summary defines a visible heading for details element. Let's take a closer look at the header and footer elements. The header element defines the header for a web page, article or document. A header typically features titles, logos or photos and may be the first thing that a user sees upon visiting a site. The footer element defines a footer for a web page, article or document and are typically located at the bottom. A footer typically features information about a page such as the copyright date and miscellaneous links. Header and footer elements, so you can see where they fit in on a typical web page. Obviously header at the top, footer at the bottom. Let's have a look at the section element. So the section element defines sections in a document or web page. There's certain situations where other tags should be used, including, so in the situation where you've got separate content that is independent from other content on the page, you would use article. If you plan to syndicate or sort of sell on to other content producers that particular block of content, you would also use article. If you want to create a sidebar with content inside it, you would use aside. And if you want to wrap and position multiple sections that are not related to each other, then you should use div. although the H group element is actually deprecated now, let's have a quick look at it. The H group element is used to group headings. So you can see on the right hand side you've got the H group element, and inside you have the H1 and H3 tags, which are nested inside the H group element. So H group allows you to organize heading tags but won't impact the way that things look on a web page. You could consider using H group when you have a heading and a subheading right after each other. Okay, so the nav element then. So the nav element defines a block of navigation links. The nav tag shouldn't be used for every link on a page, but rather to group the links together. The article and aside elements. So the article element defines independent self-contained content. An example of self-contained content could be a news article or a blog entry. The aside element, however, is used to set aside a subset of content from the overall content. It's important to note that the aside tag doesn't change how the content appears on the page. If you want to change the placement of an element, then you'll have to use CSS to do so. Let's have a look at tables and lists. Tables used to be used a lot in HTML4 and earlier in order to structure content on a web page, and tended to obviously result in a very blocky looking kind of website. They're still used in HTML5, but they're not used to lay out content. They're just used for displaying data the same way perhaps you might use a spreadsheet to display data, i.e. really for their kind of original intended purpose. So tables consist of columns and rows, and they display content in a grid. So to create a table with HTML, you would use a combination of the tags featured in the table below. So table would actually create a table, tr would create rows, th creates headers, td creates cells or columns within rows, col group is used to apply styles to a range of columns, thead marks a group of header rows, tfoot marks a group of footer rows, tbody is used to format groups of rows, and caption marks text as a caption. This table demo you can see within the MTA PDF. It's also really easy to look it up on W3 Schools, which I kind of recommend to you. Okay, so you can see all the, or a few anyway, of the elements that we just talked about. Obviously table, and then in there you've got table rows, and the table cells, also th for the table heading. Let's look at lists. Okay, within HTML there's two main types of list, ordered and unordered. An ordered list will basically number each item 1, 2, 3, A, B, C, etc. in a list, whereas unordered lists will use bullet points. Okay, so if you want to create an ordered list, you use the OL tag, and then you basically use the list tag nested inside the OL element. Unordered lists, you would use the UL tag. Quick demo, again in the book. You've got an ordered list of favourite foods, so this would list number 1 pizza, number 2 cake, and then you've got a to-do list, which would just be bullet points. Quick look at the menu element. Okay, this is something that is mentioned in the syllabus, so we're including it here. This element is only supported by Firefox. Okay, so the menu tag defines a list or menu of commands, and then the menu tag is used for context menus, toolbars, and for listing form controls and commands. And this will be used with the menu item tag. So this is a menu that would basically appear if you right-click on the mouse. Okay, and then you get an extra couple of elements come up in that menu, which you would define using that menu item tag. Let's have a look at input and forms. A web form is a page that features input fields where users can enter data. Form input, or the data supplied by users, is sent to a server where it's processed and stored. Web forms are commonly used when making purchases, signing up for newsletters, or completing surveys. you have a typical, very simple form on the left-hand side. When creating a form, you should use the form element. It's common practice to use an ID attribute with forms. The label element displays a label for each field. The input element is used to dictate the type of input that is expected. This table shows a few types of input. We have text, which creates a text field. Password would create a password field. Submit creates a submit button. Radio is used for a radio button that can be selected. Checkbox creates a checkbox field. Date would require users to enter a valid date. Email would require a valid email address, and search creates a search field. Let's look at input attributes and values that are associated with forms. So there's a number of attributes that can be used with the input element to enhance web forms. You would use the autofocus attribute to point to the focus to a specific input field when a web page loads. You would use the required attribute when a field is required, and use the placeholder attribute to add text to a field that will help users know what to enter. You can see the markup associated with each one of these attributes on the right hand side of the page. This web form demo can also be seen within the PDF for the MTA course. You can also find similar demos on W3 Schools. Form validation. Validation is the process of verifying that the information obtained from a form is in the appropriate format. Common issues that can arise with forms are empty fields, invalid email addresses, invalid dates, and text versus numbers and vice versa. In HTML4, validation required the use of JavaScript, but in HTML5 there's now automatic validation, which can help speed up the validation process. Now, client-side validation is when a browser validates data provided by a user. If validation is performed by a server, then it's called server-side validation. If a user enters the wrong value into a form field, then the browser will instruct them to correct the error. The browser determines if the data is valid by reading attributes in the form's tags, such as the pattern attribute. You can see in the left-hand side of the screen that somebody has entered an invalid email address, and so the browser instructs the user to provide a valid email address. You might want to spend a few minutes having a read through these phrases and deciding whether they're true or false. A quick summary of what we've looked at. We've looked at semantic HTML, tables and lists, input and forms, and form validation. This summary is just that. I mean, what we've looked at in this lesson is a summary of what you need to know. You'll need to spend some time reading the content of the book and researching, looking into more on W3 Schools about each of the topics we've looked at.